My buddy Tom Murphy's coming on today, and I actually met him on season 2 of The Ultimate Fighter. Now, he was working for the enemy. He was on the other team. Yeah, and so through that, he and I became really good friends. And as time progressed, he had a couple fights in the UFC and then ended up pursuing different careers. He had a career in the railroad industry. He was always very successful, good business leader, very motivating guy. And he's one of these guys that I look up to. Like, it's like, that's the guy I want to aspire to be. He has this organization called Sweethearts and Heroes where they do bullying programs, anti-bullying programs in schools and other organizations for that matter. And this is one of those things with him where he'll go into a school and he has this entire curriculum. It's amazing the work that he does. But Tom's like, it's the life that he lives. Like, he walks this walk, man. He has this restaurant, and if we have time today, we'll chat about it. But he has this restaurant where during the pandemic, the restaurant shut down, and they kept their entire staff on. They didn't let anybody go. They didn't downsize. They gave away all these free meals, free. And during the pandemic, when all restaurants are struggling, like I've invested in a restaurant, and it was their best financial year ever after giving all these meals away. And he did that as a means to attach to the community, like to create community. And so it's not this Sweethearts and Heroes that he does in these bullying programs and talking about schools and, you know, especially on the backside of the pandemic and how kids in schools are suffering now. But this is a guy that just really walks the walk, man. Like, he lives this thing inside and out. It's not just a job he does.
I feel we don't have enough of those people out there regularly doing everything, you know?
No.
And I got to say, it's crazy how you may take a loss in the beginning of doing something like giving free meals to your community in a time of need, but then the community comes full circle and promotes you to levels that you didn't even dream of, man.
This is the same concept. If you've been to church, like giving my offering, right? It's like, I'm going to give my portion to the Lord, and I end up being blessed more financially when I'm freely giving as opposed to not. And it's not necessarily just putting money in an offering plate or whatever. It's helping poor people out and everything else that goes along with it, buying somebody lunch if they can't afford it. So
100%.
Yeah.
I think he joined. So let's let him in.
Quite frankly, it's kind of unusual.
It's quite Franklin.
Got it. Quite Franklin.
So, you know what's funny, Tom, is like I was when I was prepping for this podcast, I'm trying to look for just obscure things. And I found this interview from you of 2012. And it was so funny in the interview. You were just talking about random things, and then there was one section you're like, there are people in this industry that I really respect, and you're like Rich Franklin, he's a good guy, and you talked about how you and I went to church together. And it jogged my memory. I was like, oh wow, I forgot that you were here and you'd gone to church with me. It was really cool. But it was interesting hearing you say that, because like I look at the work you do with Sweethearts and Heroes, and I'm like, man, this is a guy who, if I had to sum you up in one word, this is a man who lives his passion. And when you say that about people, typically they think like, oh, you know, I'm passionate about fighting, so that's what I chose for my career or whatever. It's like, no, you're actually passionate about helping people. Truly one of the most empathetic people I've ever met in my life. And you live this passion on a daily basis. And you've talked about this in interviews before, but this comes from the environment you grew up in with your parents. And I don't know if Cody's ever heard this story. So for the listeners, can you tell the story about what your home life was like growing up?
Yeah, it was pretty unique. I was born and raised in Philadelphia for the first 10 years of my life. And I thought everyone had homeless people living in their house. It's kind of a crazy little statement, but I don't have any other memory except for people sharing our house, sharing our dinner table. You know, I've said, and I only started talking about this a couple of years ago, really. It's kind of weird when you get into middle school and high school and you're like, hey, yeah, we got homeless people living in our barn. You know, it's not something you really talk about. But, you know, I don't know why my parents did it, my father in particular, but opened up our doors. And this wasn't a registered, you know, shelter or home. It was just opening up our doors and bringing people in, and people that had challenges. And I could write story after story about my brothers and sisters growing up. And, you know, I've even said my parents at one point gave my bedroom away, and I slept in a bathtub for a year.
That's crazy.
Because someone needed that room more than I did. And, you know, I've got, you know, most of the stories don't have happy endings. You know, sad to think about, but just people that truly epitomize this word that maybe we'll talk about, hopelessness. And, and it's still, I'm stuttering around here because it doesn't make sense to my brain. My parents had three biological children that were in some very fundamental early stages of development. And, we think about protecting children at that age. And my dad opened up our doors and brought people in. And I saw people get dragged out of our house. I watched my dad hold a guy down once that was, under the influence. We called him Crazy Bob. He had this giant big head of red hair, and he lost his mind one night at dinner. And I remember sitting at the top of the stairs. I don't think I've ever told this story. And, looking down the banister and my dad wrestling this man to the ground and chairs breaking and smashing into the table. And the police had to be called to drag him out. These are the people that, I grew up with, and it was just normal for me. And so I don't know, that's kind of the people always say to me, they say, how did Sweethearts and Heroes begin? And I can tell the quick, cheap little version of someone asking me to talk about bullying and, going on from there and a couple of million kids later. But as I really reflect on it, and have for many years now, it started when I was a kid, and the brothers and sisters that I grew up with that just had some real challenges.
Talk about Sweethearts and Heroes for everybody.
Yeah. It, a happy little accident, the great Bob Ross would say. But it's funny because
it's funny that you quoted Bob Ross. That's what I'm laughing about.
It wasn't meant to have. It wasn't a plan. It was just and I look at my mixed martial arts career. The only reason it really happened, there's no doubt in my mind, was for this. I got done this crazy little show, The Ultimate Fighter, which I never watched season 1. I had no interest in it. I didn't even apply to it. My sister applied me to the show.
For everybody listening, this is how Tom and I met. Actually, is he was a competitor on season 2 of The Ultimate Fighter, and he was the enemy because you were on Matt's team at the time. So, but you and I ended up developing a really good friendship off of that show, and so I was sitting there, I was thinking about today a couple days ago. I'm like, well, how did Tom ever even end up on season 2 of The Ultimate Fighter? Because it just seems out of character for you from what from everything else I know about you.
Yeah, I'll weave, Sweethearts and Heroes into this, but just really quickly, my sister loved the show. I, got done wrestling in college, and I just was one of these guys that I'm a training junkie. Yeah. Like if I compete, okay, great. But I'd rather just be in the gym training 6-7 days a week. I'm not a nice person when I don't work out. But, I got done wrestling in college. I wasn't ready to stop. And, I got into some jujitsu. The way the universe works, I moved to Vermont in 1999 after college, and just happened to be placed in a spot where one of the greatest jujitsu people on planet Earth lived, or still lives. He's one of the only people I think on Earth that has a coral belt, a guy named Julio Fernandez. And, the guy talked me into doing some jujitsu. He was on Carlson's team in Brazil and moved to Vermont. And Julio's in his 60s or 70s now. But I just started doing a little bit of jujitsu and got choked silly. And I'm like, man, I got to figure this out. I was like a runner up in the country in the Division III. And I was getting choked silly by like these jujitsu people. And so I just started playing around with it, got addicted to it. The Ultimate Fighter 1 had just taken off. And my sister was watching the show, and she's like, oh, you got to apply for this. And I'm like, yeah, it's not really my thing. She applied me. I literally, Rich, got done training one day at Julio's, turned the camera on. This is Julio Fernandez. And of course, Stephan Bonner had been on the show, and Carlson used to come out to Vermont all the time for Julio because he grew up with him. And I'm like, I trained with Carlson Gracie. And at that time, maybe I trained with Carlson twice. And then I went home, and I had a garage, and I was like, I don't know why I grabbed my camera, but I pulled my camera out of my bag, and my kids were all little at the time. And I hear them going crazy in my garage where I had a little wrestling room. And I'm like, these are my real training partners. And I open the door, and my kids are like going berserk, and they're like all under the age of 6 or 7. I'm like, there they are. That's why I'm so tough. And I literally, one take on both of those my sister sent the tape in, and I get the call, and kind of the rest. There's a lot more to the story, but after the show, I just had a lot of people that reached out to me and said, "Hey, could you talk to my basketball team and my baseball team and my cheerleading team? They saw you in the show." And you're not going to believe this either. I've never watched season 2 of The Ultimate Fighter.
I do stuff like that all the time. Like when I'm in something, I'm like, nah, I don't want to watch it, particularly when it's out of element. And I've seen that season because each week I watch that season. And I mean, you and I know that they have the ability to edit any way they want.
Yeah.
Right. And so they can paint whatever picture you want. So, and which can be a really, really bad thing, And so each week I'm sitting there watching it like, all right, what kind of storyline are they going to create this week? Like what is going to be misrepresented, filmed out of order, whatever, because they got to edit it and put it together so that it follows the storyline. And it's not huge misrepresentations, but little things here and there that can create these like subplots. And so each week I'm like, oh, okay, I survived another week. My reputation is still intact.
Yeah, I can tell you a crazy story about the way they were going to write my part.
Yeah.
Like it's a crazy story. I've never really told. I don't know if I'm supposed to or allowed to. I mean, it's been a long time, so I guess I could, but if you want me to, I'll tell you. But regardless, just people ask me, they said, "Hey, Tom, could you talk to these teams and those teams?" And I'm like, yeah. And I would go in, and I've just had a lot of great coaches in my life, and not really even sports coaches, but I have a great business career. I worked for a guy that took our holding company in the railroad industry from $500 million to $2 billion, and got to work directly for him. So I've always been able to take these great little lessons and just especially give them to young people. And so I started doing that, on weekends and Fridays. And a buddy of mine that I wrestled with in college said, "Hey, could you do something on bullying?" I was supposed to be in charge of this presentation, and it fell through last minute. There was an Olympic speed skater, and his training schedule changed. And I'm like, yeah, I guess I could do something on bullying. And, I did my homework and, looked at it from my perspective. And then I marched it into this school, and about 900 kids that one day, just me. And really the rest is history. 2 million kids later, from Houston to Hawaii to Montreal and back several times. Added a speaking partner a couple years into Sweethearts and Heroes. And, we've created something that it's hard to capture what Rick and I have done over the last 15 years, well, maybe 13 years, when it comes to what's really happening with the youth across America.
I had a similar experience. I think I told you the story a while back, but my niece was at the time, she was in the 3rd grade, and she was getting bullied at school, and primarily because she told everybody that she was my niece. And they didn't believe her. Like, and then she started getting bullied because they were like, you're a liar. And so, I said to her, I said, you know what, let me come in and talk to the class. Like, I'll just talk to the class more or less to establish the fact that you actually truly know me. And so I said, I said to her mom, I said, check with the school and see if they want me to come in. I'll just talk to the class so it stops this thing. Like I can. And then suddenly the school gets back like, well, can you just speak to the school? So I was going to go in and talk to a classroom of 30 kids, and I ended up talking about bullying. And this was just my perspective on bullying. And then the next thing I know, I step into this entire elementary of like, I don't know, 1,500 kids or whatever it was. Like the entire gymnasium was full. Was not prepping for this.
It can be intimidating. I still to this day, it's funny, these feelings that you get when you're backstage and you're scared to death. It doesn't matter who you're going to go out and compete against. You feel like you're going to throw up. And I still get that feeling when I go out on stage, and, there's nothing harder than a group of middle schoolers. Elementary school kids aren't real hard. You can go out there and say or do just about anything. And I play old Mr. Incredible when I talk to elementary kids. It's Mr. Incredible and his friend Rick, who's really, really different. But when you go out in front of high schoolers, like, they've been conditioned, most of them, like, keep your mouth shut, cross your arms, fall asleep if you want to. But middle schoolers will eat you alive.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh, they'll destroy you. So
It's like being a stand-up comedian and then walking out and then just falling flat on that stage and getting no reaction from the audience with middle schoolers. They're tough. But you guys have a really, like, Sweethearts and Heroes has a really good presentation that you put together with so you approach what you do with the elementary kids, the middle school kids, and the high school kids differently, or do you, because you guys do a lot of role playing, the circle that you do, is it all approached similarly or differently for each age group?
it's been such a maturation, the growth of Sweethearts and Heroes. We started with this silly little presentation for middle schoolers, and I thought that that's where, our best work was. And that's some of my favorite work is middle and high school, because I can get very passionate and relate to those kids more. But I think the greatest work we do is with elementary school students. If I were to ask you or Cody, what do you do when you catch on fire? In the blink of an eye, you'll say, stop, drop, and roll. You won't even hesitate. And well, you might, because you've gotten older now, but you get in front of 100 students, you say that, and they all unanimously will scream that out. You don't teach a high school or a middle schooler what to do when they catch on fire or fire drills. You teach it when they're young. And, truly, if we want to code some of this solution in our young people, it's got to start at that age. But yeah, but the message, Rich, is the same. It's about hope and it's about action, and it's never changed. It's about student empowerment. And when I say that, most people think that we're talking about empowering, kids that are, marginalized, kids that have challenges, and nothing could be further from the truth. I don't even go to school for those students. And that always makes people frown or scratch their head and say, well, Tom, I thought that's what you do. Well, I don't understand that perspective. I probably never will understand that perspective. The perspective that I understand is the same one that you understand, Rich, which is you watched it from the outside. 96, I'm guessing, 96% of all that negative behavior is never addressed by adults or teachers. Yet 85% of the time, there's other students present when people are being mistreated, when they're being bullied, when there's negative behavior coming. And when I walk up to any kid in America and I say, what do you do when you see someone not being treated the right way? Out of 50 million public school students that are just bystanders, they'll look at you and say, tell a teacher. Like, they really have no idea what to do. So our initial approach, which has never really changed, was to train those students when they see someone not being treated the right way, that they know exactly what to do. And the secret are Sweethearts and Heroes. It's about hope and it's about action. Those are the two main pillars. And then from there, I'll just mention this quick and you can jump back in. From there, I mean, that's always stayed true to our message, and it's part of our assemblies and it's part of our curriculum. But the really deep work we do is around empathy and its growth. So, but that's been the message of Sweethearts and Heroes from day one.
You and I grew up, we're Gen Xers, and so we grew up in the pre-internet era, the non-digital age. Has bullying in school changed, like the nature of bullying now that, because I mean, you can digitally bully people and things. I was talking to a friend the other day. I said, if you did something, like if you attended a high school party when I was in high school and you did something stupid or something embarrassing happened to you, the only people that saw it were the people that were there, and it kind of lived in that moment. And these people might be able to, make fun of you or whatever, but it's gone. Now everybody's got these things out, right? So they're constantly doing this. And so if something like that happens now, it lives perpetually in the digital world. How do you see this be like, cause you're hands-on. And even when I was teaching, I mean, the reason why this is something of interest to me is because, I mean, I was a high school teacher and I dealt with bullying, but even still at the time where I was teaching, it was for the most part at least modern social media digital era, right? Where this stuff existed as easily as accessible as it is now. So I still wasn't dealing with this kind of stuff when I was a teacher, but has the nature of bullying really changed since the 80s to current day?
Oh man, that's like a 5-hour conversation. Number one, if you're listening to this and you want to really start to understand it, Gene Twangy's book, iGen, is a great place to start. Understanding some of these dynamics. You have this characteristic of bullying that's been around for thousands and thousands of years. People have always intimidated people over and over again. Happened at the bus stop, the locker, the mouth of your cave, whatever. That's just one of the great natures of human. of humanity is that we know how to mistreat each other very well, right?
Yeah.
We also know how to take care of each other. But when you talk about cyber, we know that students that are cyberbullied are 3 to 4 times more likely to make a destructive decision. Now think about that, 3 to 4 times more likely, because the game has changed. You used to be able to, avoid me. So if your locker was next to mine, you might be able to, come to your locker a minute late, knowing that I'm not going to be there. You can't do that anymore in this new digital age.
Yeah, exactly.
I think here's what I'll say, because I could ramble about this for hours and hours. I think the greatest difference is it used to be one person intimidating, or a group of people intimidating or scaring that target. I think the greatest change, the 6 inches between your ears, somebody can post something one time. And how many times, Rich or Cody, have you gone back to a post, a comment, a share, and saw how many likes it got, how many new comments it got? I mean, you will repetitively go back to those things over and over and over again. And so bullying used to be one person habitually intimidating another person over and over again. I think that one of the greatest changes is that targets now will do a large amount of it to themselves, because they will continue, as one mom told me, my son lives in his private misery in his bedroom.
Yeah.
John Halligan, we're on here right now. He would tell you his son, Ryan, it happened in his bedroom, but he did it mostly to himself because he went back to it over and over and over again. And that's really the danger of this cyber world, is that, a lot of it is just not part of reality, or it's just their reality and not what's actually really happening. It may be that's just one really main thing that I like to really point out with parents and teachers and even students. Are you doing this to yourself, or is it really happening by someone else?
I'll say this. Another thing along this lines is that if there is bullying, whether you're doing it to yourself or not, typically when there's bullying, you basically break down into 3 groups: the bully, the bullied, and then the bystanders, right? So what's the difference in the digital world because when you actually physically see bullying going on, and you've especially been part of something like a Sweethearts and Heroes, and you're equipped with the tools that you need in order to intervene, what's the process for that in the digital world? Because it's much more difficult to intervene.
When we first came up with this plan, we said, it's as simple as the ABCs, and it's part of our action plan for little kids, but it's also a plan for exactly what why Stop, Drop, and Roll works, because it's simple, it's action-based, and it's life-saving.
Yeah.
It's simple, it's action-based, and it's life-saving. So that was always our solution. We always started with little kids, and we said, it's as simple as the ABCs. And what's the first thing a hero does when someone's in danger? The first thing, fly in and take the person
away.
That's with an A, Rich.
Yeah, away.
Right. So that's simple. It's action-based, and it's life-saving. And it's really as simple as when you see someone not being treated the right way. The science says you got about 10 seconds. They say peers intervene less than 10% of the time. But if a hero jumps into action within the first 10 seconds, they can be successful at intervening almost 60% of the time, is the stat. So you go from about a 4 to 10% intervention rate with students. And when you teach them how to jump into action, to own that moment, we call it, that first 10 seconds, because that's what heroes do, right? They own the moment. And if you can practice that skill like any other skill, it's crazy. We teach, this is a great teacher, a great comment or question for a math teacher. Can you imagine walking up to a kid and saying, hey, I'm going to explain the equation to you one time. Good luck. I'll see you at the test. No, don't practice it. Right? You'd never do that. That would be that sounds crazy to do that. But that's what we do with our young people. We say, hey, stick up for that kid that's different. Good luck. I'll see you at the test.
Yeah.
And there's no greater math equation than going into a cafeteria and seeing a kid that stinks and people making fun of him. I mean, you're not going to, as a middle schooler, do anything about that. But when you can teach kids and you can practice these skills over and over again, like walking up to someone that's not being treated the right way and saying, hey, man, coach wants me to put these balls on the field. Can you help me? And you take them away. I'm going to get to your cyber piece here. I'm going to link it together. But, as we started to unfold these ABCs and these superpowers that we were giving to kids, I wrestled with this whole notion of, the digital world. And I'm like, and I was trying to get involved in something I didn't really understand. Nicholas Carr wrote a great book called The Shallows, and he just explains how their brains are wired differently than ours. And your brain was compartmentalized. You went to different classes and you understand time and space differently than a kid today because information is free and their little brains are wired differently. So as I was really struggling with this with myself, like 6-7 years ago, trying to, how do we apply these ABCs, to the digital world? I can close my eyes, Rich, and I can see this kid sitting on the bleachers afterward, and we're talking about some challenges, and he was gaming and virtually with these other kids, and one kid started really being nasty, and so he back channels or DMs the kid that they were picking on, and he says, "Hey, let's go over and play this game," and he sent him a link. But what did he do? He took him
away. Yeah.
Away. And I was like, oh my gosh, like this is their world. I call it stealing from Aldous Huxley. This is truly a brave new world. And you and I have no idea how to truly navigate in it.
Nope.
And so for me, if I truly believe that our students are the answer, the solution against this war of hopelessness, because it's not about bullying, man. It's really not. It's about this feeling of hopelessness. Our kids are going to be the ones that have to solve this. And really, it just proved to me, and I could take you through a whole bunch of other examples of these young people will come up with the solutions if we allow them to be creative, if we allow them to really have the freedom to operate in this space and apply some of the same lessons that we bring to this digital world, they'll figure it out. And so it was just a beautiful example of like me not solving the problem, but this young man knew how to do it. But now he knows that he's empowered to do this every single time that he sees someone not being treated the right way online. You can always fly in digitally and take the person away.
Yeah, but when you make that comment about the 10-second rule, so to speak, and the increasing the probability of success there, oftentimes when comments are made on social media, when you're live interacting gaming, that's easy to do, right? But I might, for example, see somebody getting bullied on a social media and be like, I'm going to step in and say and make a comment, because if somebody like me steps in, then for a person that's getting bullied, but I might not see it for 20 minutes, 2 hours, 2 days, a week later. And by that time the damage is done, the space, I'm not there in that first 10 seconds. Does you think that rule still applies in the digital world?
Well, I would say what's B? It's our next superpower, which has become that person's buddy,
yeah.
Right? And that sounds kind of silly. And you're like, well, that's not a real superpower. I've had kids say that to me. Well, that's not a real superpower. I'll say, I'll bet you it is. I said, you ever seen Superman fly up to somebody that was falling from a building and get right in their face and say, ooh, I'm going to let this one hit the street? Like, no, never. Like superheroes don't do that. So when you see that comment, your first reaction for that kid that, sleeps on a couch in a trailer, everybody knows his mom's got a drug or alcohol problem. What are you going to do as a middle schooler? I can't talk to that kid, right? No, just say that you're not a superhero. Like that's the real comment. Like you could, if you want to, or if you train yourself to. So you can still use that be buddy when you see something and send someone a DM later on and say, man, I saw this comment that someone made about you. I just wanted to tell you I was thinking about you, or maybe we could do something together. And, that positive energy that you send, especially if it's Rich Franklin, the awesome wrestler, or, football player. Well, I'm just saying, you got those kids in school, like the young Tom Murphy, who was a great wrestler, but I never really understood that it was my job to jump into action. I mean, people are always looking up to me to a certain extent because of my athleticism. And do you think I jumped into action? Did I know it was my job to do that as a kid? No.
Yeah.
But in this digital world, you can have rock star kids that are, making TikToks that people are following that could jump into action at a later time.
Yep.
So I think it still follows the same rules. It's just about allowing them to operate in this space.
Talk to me about the pandemic, kids being stuck at home, living in this virtual world. I listened to an interview that you did, and you talked about the developmental years and how when you miss those developmental windows that of play You know what I'm talking about? That you end up missing, like when you miss that play window, you end up missing a lot of development. And we've all been quarantined, locked down, and for specific times. And kids have missed school years, things like proms, graduation ceremonies, birthdays, like these. You've seen these drive-by birthdays, and so the human connection element has started to, show its roots. And there was a comment, maybe in one of your interviews, one of the teachers was talking about that said that the pandemic won't end until this group of kids that have gone through it have actually graduated.
Let me first say, and I've talked, hundreds of hours about this pandemic, and Rick and I never stopped during the pandemic. We did over 100 presentations online with different schools and groups, and but I'm very clear as I talk about this. This line, this trajectory that our young people have been on, empathy has been declining for the last 30 years. This is not something new. Personal connection has been going the wrong direction for a long time. And I'm very worried, and I've got to be very careful when I say this, because I know that, the loss that people experienced during the pandemic, the other challenges that came up with moms and dads losing their jobs and all kinds of stuff. So I got to be very careful when I say this, but I feel as though there's a lot of crutches being handed out right now. And those aren't my words. That came from an educator that I just recently was talking to. And she was really brilliant. And she said that I feel like there's a lot of crutches being handed out and saying, oh, you're a pandemic kid, here, take these, and hobble around on them. But let us not forget that so much devastation from the annihilation of play, which was one of my favorite things to talk about. You think I can talk about cyber for a long time when you start talking to me about the science of play and Peter Gray's work and Stuart Brown's work on play and how it's in self-directed, self-controlled play. Stuart Brown says it's where all mammals learn to transition successfully from childhood into adulthood. It's the only place that they learn that, not in school. They learn it in play, how to cooperate, how to negotiate. That's been going steadily downward since the 1950s. And there's a very strong correlation between the lack of play and the rise in fear and anxiety and all of these other real challenges or destructive decisions that our young people have been facing. So I think all it really did, Rich, was exponentially speed up some things that were already in the works for a long time that we should be talking about. So there's just a mountain of stuff we could say about this pandemic. It does have me very concerned, but I also had a principal on Long Island say to me, she goes, I feel as though we're learning some resiliency from our children and how they adapted to this. So let us not forget just how plastic they are and what an opportunity this is. And, we went into this whole pandemic and I made the same mistake. And I started preaching about lost learning lost. And that was the big topic and discussion. And I think it was a real travesty that we did that to our educators and to our students, where we should have said, what an incredible opportunity we have to learn a new way.
Yeah.
And what about all these new skills that we can learn? So again, I don't want to beat up the pandemic. It happened. And, did Rick getting blown to hell, losing his ears, his nose, his leg, and being able to say, I'm sure just like Cody, I hope maybe getting cancer was the best thing that ever happened.
Since you mentioned Rick, talk about him real quick. I'll interject here. I want to get back to this pandemic thing, but talk about Rick, his service, what happened to him, and the impact that he actually has on the students when in these programs.
I call him one of the world's hope experts. He laid on the ground in Iraq, September 1st, 2006, looked up in the sky as his ears had burned off and his nose burned away and 70% of his body melted. And he looked up in the sky and he decided to give up. He'll tell you it's the greatest regret in his life that he decided to give up. And what did he decide to give up? This thing called hope. And hope stands for hold on, possibilities exist. And I'm sure, Cody, you've felt that. Like, what reason do I have to hold on? What possibilities exist for my future? And it's really hard to see that. But, Viktor Frankl said that the greatest meaning in life comes from the attitude that we take towards the unavoidable suffering that we go through. I read that years ago in Man's Search for Meaning. And I was like, yeah, I get that. But I don't think I'll ever get that, or I hope I never get that. But spending so much time with Rick, he's just epitomized it. If he were on this call with us, he would tell you it's the best thing that ever happened to him, and he wouldn't change it for anything. And I remember when he told me that, it boggled my mind. And I spent a couple of years trying to tease it out and saying, no, like going to Disney World is the best thing that's happened to someone, not getting blown up in Iraq and deciding to die. And, I've stood in hundreds of auditoriums and watched tears roll down faces of young people that feel hopeless on the inside. And there's Rick Yarish talking to him and saying, you know what? Getting blown up was the best thing that ever happened to me. And as I really unpacked that, what I discovered was that if Rick got it all back and his hands were melted together, he'd have to take back all that hope he's given to other people, and it wouldn't be worth it. And that's what he'd tell you. And, it's just the lessons are unbelievable. So anyway, that's Rick. I could talk about that guy for days.
When people go through traumatic things like that, it's crazy what the perspective that they end up having on the back end of an experience. I'll give you an example. I had a podcast guest on this. Her name was Chandra Wawarantu. She was an Indonesian woman who was brought to the U.S. for part-time work, thought she was getting a legitimate job, and then trafficked into the sex industry and was held prisoner for I don't know how many months. And there's a section on that podcast we talk about just the mathematics of how many men she had to service during her time while she was there. And she actually escaped from this situation, this brothel, by tying sheets together like you see in a movie from prison, tied sheets together and climbed out this window. And on the back end of that, she talked about forgiveness, and it was just such a powerful piece, And I'm like, sometimes I listen to people like Rick or someone like Chandra, and I'm like, man, I don't know that I have that kind of ability, even like, and this coming from a Christian man. Like, I'm like, I don't know if I'm capable of that truly. And it just makes you reflect internally. But I'll say this on a much smaller scale than getting hit with an ID in Iraq. On the back end of my career, I think losing my title was one of the best things that ever happened to me, because, I saw myself drifting down a path on this side. Now I see myself drifting down a path of life that I otherwise wouldn't want to have drifted down. Things like materialism becomes a bit more important to you when you start making that kind of money. And I think that was God's way of like putting me back in check. Like, hey, hold on a second here, pal. And because I think I was at a fork there where my life could have gone two completely different ways, So at the time that night, I remember sitting in my hotel room, like just scratching my head, like, what the heck is going on here? Why, how? And when you look at it with that perspective, it's just much different. But I don't know. Forgiving somebody for hitting me with an IED is a much more significant level of forgiveness.
Yeah, and it was a human being. When they did the investigation, they found a wire that went about a half a mile and two frayed ends, and someone just sits there and touches a battery to it. So this wasn't like a pressure switch. There was another human being, a man, a woman, a child, at the other end of that when Rick went across it, touched the battery to the wire and blew him up. That's tough to think about. But Rick does it. I don't, it's still, man, 10 years later, it still has my eggs scrambled upstairs. Like, man, I mean, Montez died next to him 7 days later, because of the injuries he got. And to say that, I think Rick would tell you if Montez could come back, he would take it all back. Yeah. But that would probably be it. But no other reason. I mean, he wouldn't have his wife and his children if he didn't get blown up in Iraq. I mean, it's just so crazy to think about, right? But I mean, Viktor Frankl and so many others laid this out for us that went through these unimaginable challenges. I mean, Cody, I'm assuming you lost your leg to this. I don't know. That
Cody told me a really powerful story one time, because that people go when you have cancer, and he went through his chemo treatments, and he was talking about the chemo treatments, and he lost his hair, and he was like, yeah, I was cool with it. And he had some friends that shaved their head, and But he tells us this story. I should let you tell. It was when you talked about losing your eyebrows.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it
Yep.
was a whole different level at that point.
Yeah, it was one of those things where all the hair on my body went away besides my eyebrows. So for about 4 months, I walked around like in my opinion, a muscular, because I was a wrestler and all that stuff at the time. So little body fat, just this attractive wrestler bald guy. That's what I thought. And I was like, oh, I can play the cancer card, pick up girls. This is going to be the greatest thing of my life. And it wasn't until surgery when I had to go back to chemo, then the eyebrows fell out. And that came basically from limping to the bathroom to go to the bathroom. And then my face itched and I just rubbed them a little bit and then they just came off into my hand. And man, I was immediately in tears and prayer because I was like, I don't know who's looking back at me in the mirror. It was for the first time I saw a cancer patient. And there was a lot of stuff that you said about your friend Rick that I was relating to, not in the sense of obviously being blown up or anything like that, because that is further than anything that I've went through. However, cancer was the greatest experience of my life. It humbled me. It simmered me down. It allowed me to see perspective as a 14-year-old that I never would have had in my life. And really, it framed the picture of what my future was. And I changed. So it wasn't a hopeless question per se, but it was the one time during my battle, I almost uttered the words, why me?
Yeah.
And I didn't even finish that question. And I was immediately like praying and like for forgiveness because I almost questioned the path.
Yeah.
And since I chose to have ownership on that question, and now it's why not me? Hence walking across America, things of that nature. It is the hope, which is why I called that the walk for hope. Anything else I do will be whatever for hope, because that mindset is everything that allows you to accomplish, achieve, do anything in your life. As I say, breathe, believe, and achieve.
You know, Rick taught me years ago that we all have hope inside of us that we can give to other people. And Rick didn't need to teach me that. It's probably, it's, you know, who was it that said, was it Paul or someone that said, always be ready to give an answer for the hope that you have within you? You know, that's the beginning of the solution to this issue of hopelessness, is that we all carry hope with us that we can give to other people if we choose to. And that's the sweetheart piece. And, you know, I discovered that when I was asked to do this bullying presentation. I'm like, what am I going to do? And I looked up the word bully, and I found that in the 16th century, the word bully meant sweetheart. And that, you know, people always like, what are you talking about? And it was this very endearing term. You know, about 40 years after Columbus sailed, that someone invented this word bully, which meant sweetheart. And it was someone in your life that pushed you, made you stronger, made you faster. It wasn't always easy on you. And it's one of these common threads that we all share as humans. And I've never met a person in my life. You can talk to anybody and say, hey, who's one of your 16th century bullies? And you explain to them what the word bully meant. And you say, if I took this person out of your past, you wouldn't be who you are today. They literally changed the trajectory of your life. And that's the beginning of the solution to this issue. And our kids are all walking around these schools and communities. Humans are walking around their communities, and they're the solution. They're the ones that have the hope inside of them that can recognize someone that's in this suffering and can give it to them. But it's a choice that you have to make, or you don't.
I'd love to connect after this, by the way. And
yeah, man, I'd love to talk, Cody.
There's something that it's going to become the main idea of our nonprofit now. I won't go into it right now because it's still in works, but cancer patients and kids with any of those illnesses are always getting bullied. There was a girl I connected with on the walk. She was bullied because people thought she was pregnant because her body was retaining a lot of water weight, but she was bald, no hair, and she was bullied at high school because as a 15-year-old, because they thought she was pregnant and going that whole thing. So not only are these kids fighting for their lives, but now they're having to take on the battles of just their peers. And so I think you'll relate and connect with some of that.
that's the challenging part is, they still have these brains that are in massive development and they've got to go through these challenges. So yeah, man, I would love to chat with you about the work that you're doing. Anytime I can get my hands on young people that are struggling and feel that feeling of hopelessness, because that's what drives a kid to make a destructive decision. Suicides in 10 to 14-year-olds have tripled since 2007.
Yeah.
And in some claim that under 14, it's quadrupled.
Let me ask you along those lines, Tom. Kind of disconnected, but somewhat connected. What are your thoughts on like the rise of things like suicides, depression, and things like school shootings that have gone on? What connection is that to? I mean, obviously there are some situations where there's maybe like psychological issues or things that are not necessarily connected to bullying, but I don't know. I don't know if you could actually make the argument that bullying of some sort wasn't present in these situations. Your work with the programs that the schools that you speak to and stuff, how does it connect and relate into that as well?
I've read everything I can get my hands on when it comes to Columbine and the challenges that those young men faced. And it's really easy to blame it on mental health. And trust me, I'm the first one to say there's definitely some stuff going on there between that kid's ears, some damage, born a certain way, a genetic defect. I'm the first one to say that. But I went publicly with a couple friends and said, when Parkland happened, I'll bet you Nicholas Cruz was about as hopeless as they come. And, it's funny when you read Fahrenheit 451, and I saw this article. I'd never really read the book, and we open up our presentation with something called perspective, because that's where everything ends. And it's the foundation of empathy is taking perspective, which I won't go into now. But I saw this article that said perspective, and this young lady had written, and it said this is right after Parkland. It said social media and guns, how we use them determines outcome. And she opens it, this article by a quote from Brown. I'll just summarize it, by Ray Bradbury in Fahrenheit 451. And Clarice, the young lady in the book, is out there smelling flowers and catching rainwater in her mouth. And here comes Montag, the protagonist, home from burning a house down, right? Because that's what it's all about. And he sees this strange kid, like, what is this girl doing? Like, she should be inside watching the family in front of the big screens. I mean, I believe, because if you take Fahrenheit 451 and Bradbury's Brave New World and you combine them, you almost have to believe in time travel. Bradbury saw in the 1950s us just sitting in front of screens, and really perplexes Montag. And she says to him, I'm afraid of, and this is what this young lady wrote in this article. She said, I'm afraid of kids my own age. They're killing us. They're killing each other. Has it always been this way? That's what she asked Montag. And, it really got me to see, this is one of the great times when I got to see that our children are the solution or the answer, because she's the one that woke Montag up. I mean, he was in this stupor, in this dazed and confused state that he had been programmed in, this, dystopia. And, they took a 16-year-old to wake him up. Sadly, she dies a couple pages later. But, as I unpack that, and as I talk to more young people, I spoke at a school in central New York. And when we left, they wrote this article, a paper, and someone sent it to me. And this young man said the same thing. He said, who actually greeted this young man every day when he was in, 7th grade? Who asked him to go out for coffee? Who asked him to go get ice cream? Who connected with this young man, Nicholas Cruz? Or was he just this monster that we had created through anger and frustration and his own issues going on in life? And what's the logical outworking of those things? And it's the same, whether a kid points a gun at himself, like Caitlin Nicole Davis, Olivia Scott, Amanda Todd, or whether they point a gun at someone else. To me, and I know this can be controversial, but to me, it's the same logical outworking of hopelessness. So I talk a lot about it. It's a tough thing to talk about. because but let's not forget, whether it's this young man in Buffalo or in Texas, it's so hard to talk about because I know as soon as I say this, people are like, oh, he's a monster. I agree. But, Rick taught me that hopeless people do crazy things.
Yeah.
Hopeless people.
I'll get backlash on that. Like, didn't just jump to classifying somebody as a monster, because some of these people are 17 years old and it's this whole negative upbringing and not so much just this person is choosing to classify his life as sinister or something, like it's like a product of a lot of variables, right?
Well, yeah, Malcolm Gladwell talks about it. He talks about the Swiss cheese effect. And, you don't have I don't know if you ever read, I don't know if it was an Outliers or Tipping Point, but he talks about the Swiss cheese, the holes have to line up, hopeless, you don't just go get bullied and it cause you to harm yourself. Like, that's not how it works. The holes have to line up. Your mom's got to have some issues. You've got to have all these other things going on in your life, and all of a sudden that's the final thing that pushes you over the edge. And I would guarantee you, any one of these shooters, there were multiple things that got him to that point. Which again, it's a tough subject to talk about because I don't know, was it Mandela or someone that talked about you can always judge a society by how they treat their children. And I worry about what we've done to our children. That's a giant discussion too. What have we done by putting phones in their hands and limiting things like play and compulsory education that has, which I live in the world of compulsory education, but it's done a number on our young people. Lots of things to talk about there.
I'm gonna switch gears on this topic a little bit. Because there was a connection in my brain. Like, I'm a big guy on nutrition, Tom. Do you guys have any nutritional component to your Sweethearts and Heroes talk? It may sound disconnected when I ask that question, but I'll give you the backstory on this. I had a guest on my podcast, a lady by the name of Dr. Julia Ruckledge, and she wrote a book called The Better Brain. And she wrote about these studies that they did with food and how, particularly with things like additives and preservatives, and how it can change the hormone profile of your brain, and how that the brain health is connected to the gut brain. And that, when your hormones are all out of whack, and this is a whole different topic for a different kind of guest, but when you see increased rates of things like attention deficit disorders and autism and everything else that goes with it, you start looking nutritionally at things such as processed foods as being a culprit. Now, obviously, when you're talking about the Swiss cheese, like, I am not going to blame kids eating Doritos and drinking Mountain Dew on that's why they shot up a school, for example, or they decide that they want to bully people. But that as a factor, as it applies to, as it connects with everything else that you're talking about, do you guys have any component like that? Do you talk to the kids about that kind of stuff, or thoughts on that?
I talk one-on-one with a lot of kids about that kind of stuff. It's a huge part of my life, my nutrition. If it wasn't for my wife, I, probably wouldn't be as diehard. And if she were on here right now and you mentioned hormones, she would go on a diatribe herself about, how the nutritional components that we pull into our body, whether even it's just from plastics and
absolutely,
the greatest thing is, did you know this? Receipts. Printed receipts.
Yeah, they have BPA are in receipts.
Yeah.
So when you get a receipt, like the worst thing you can do is like if you crumple a receipt up to throw it away, like you're in. Let me just give you a little side note on hormones. I sat next to a gentleman one time. I can't remember his name, but he worked for Children's Hospital here in UC, and we got to talking. He was the valedictorian of his graduating class at Harvard, and he conducted these studies on hormones, and he was particularly looking at canned food. And he talked about two things: plastics and canned food. And it was related to how hormone profiles of females have changed and how puberty is onsetting earlier and earlier, right? And this seems like we're off topic from like a Sweethearts and Heroes and bullying, but so in talking to him, he talked about canned foods, and he was talking about canned tomatoes, and the lining that they have to use inside a can is made with chemicals to keep the acid of the tomato from eating through the can. And obviously these chemicals are in foods foods, just touching them. I have a filtration system in my house, for example, that when I shower, it removes everything from fluoride, chlorine, any kind of like one of the biggest substances that was in Cincinnati water that I saw on a CNN report. This is probably 12 to 15-year-old stat now, but one of the largest substances was estrogen runoff from medications. And that's what gets recycled back through the water goes through the cleaning process. So when you're showering, like you're soaking all this stuff in, right? These things affect our hormone profiles, obviously. I mean, anything from a bad night of sleep to whatever. And so when you have these kids that are living in these homes where I don't know, maybe, you know, mom and dad's an alcoholic. They're fighting all the time. They're not sleeping well. They're exposed to all this stress, things like, you know, like their hormone levels are all off. Then they're eating this crappy food on top of it. And it's just like the whole system is stacked against them, you know, and then they're coming to school and they're getting bullied, or they feel the need to bully because that's what gives them their release, you know? And so anyway, so tell me about your wife's diatribe.
No, she would just say exactly what you said. And this is, you know, when you talk about weight gain or weight loss, and she's just huge on hormone systems and keeping them in balance and understanding them. And I'm going to write this down when we get off this call, because I think there is some great utility in making this another spoke in this Sweethearts and Heroes wheel. Yeah. It's a tough one because you know, it's like parenting. Like you got to go into someone's house and see how they're being parented, which a lot of kids aren't being parented. And, you know, you combine that with nutritional factors, and you combine that with lack of exercise and all these other things. I mean, I openly say it's never been harder to be a young person than it is today.
And I don't think this needs to be a major component of what you do, but it's something as simple as my life changed. My 11th grade history teacher, Mr. Zulger, I came in for the preseason track meeting of my junior year, and he made a comment about, if you're going to be an athlete, you need to eat like an athlete. You need to live like an athlete. And that one comment changed my entire life. Like the next day I used to get a chocolate milk and 2 chocolate milks and a Nutty Buddy with my lunch every day. And I came in the next day, I didn't get any Nutty Buddies, and I got white milk instead because it was less sugar. And that was my first step to eating healthy. And that one comment, just a quick little, you know, 5-second comment made all the difference in my life. Now, you know, I don't know if that's psychologically changed anything. I still seem to be pretty semi crazy, but nonetheless, you know, it's just another, like you said, a spoke in the wheel that when you're talking to these kids, maybe it resonates with somebody and makes major changes in their life that does connect back to things like depression, anxiety, school shootings, suicides, bullying, so on.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I think I have 100 conversations a month with young people on the side about nutrition, because I think it's one of the first places people should start, because when you start sleeping and eating better and hydrating yourself, you know, there are common things that we do every day, but we don't really feel their impact until they change.
Yeah.
And, you know, but yeah, that one comment's so wonderful. I mean, I moved up to Vermont and I just started training, and I went into the first bank I ever went to, and I made a comment to a woman. And then I bought a gym about 15 years later, and this lady came up to me in the gym and she goes, you know, you changed my life forever.
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't even know you. And she was my teller. Because you don't recognize me because 100 pounds later, in 15 years, she said, you told me to go take a kickboxing class. And I did. I was embarrassed, and I found a little gym with a little, you know, women's boxing class. But you're right, those little comments, and, you know, and that's hope, isn't it? Like, hold on to the possibilities that exist for your future, because they're there. And, you know, hope can be a smile. A kid that's sitting on a curb and you just happen to stop and say, hey, how you doing, man? You okay? And it's just amazing how it works. And you just never know. It's like a mustard seed, right?
I had another guest on. His name was Kevin Hines, and he was a suicide survivor. He jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge.
Yeah,
and he was on his way to the bridge that day. And he just said, if one person would have just said hello to me or asked me how I was doing, he said, I would have just told him everything. Told him what I was about to do, and it would have changed my whole life. And so I said to him on the show, I said, man, I wonder if I would have been the person on that bus that would have recognized you for being that way, or if I would have been like this in my phone, doing my thing. And, so it's simple as that. But along those lines with him, like nutrition and like lifestyle routine is a major component. If I don't know if you've ever spoken to Kevin, because you said you know him, but yeah, it's a major component of him maintaining, I guess, like his brain health and hormone profile and everything as well.
We talk about nutrition right now, and a lot of these kids don't have a lot of money per se, right? Like, if you're 14, you have no income, maybe, I don't know. Some states you can start working at 14, but stripping away the parents' income and all that, what would be the recommendation to somebody with little money to eating right or hormonal balance?
Well,
like, what is, like, to y'all's experience, like, how do you actually give advice on that?
Well, there's more stacked against you than that, because if you come from more urban areas, access to that kind of food is difficult, right? And you can look at some of the research on it, how foods are marketed in those areas. They're made cheaper for the kids to access. So when you walk in, like you're looking at buying an energy drink and a bag of chips or a candy bar, rather than, I would argue that if you could go into a convenience store and buy 2 apples, that those 2 apples will not only satiate you, but probably be cheaper than the energy drink and the bag of chips anyway. So it doesn't necessarily come down to money all the time. It does at times. Trust me, I eat healthy and I know the cost of good and proper nutritious food, but the whole deck is stacked against them, because in those areas, in areas like that, like, I mean, you can walk into a convenience store and how often do you see fresh fruit? When I'm in a more affluent neighborhood, I'll see fresh bananas or apples or something. Maybe even a truck stop, I'll see that stuff, obviously, because not every trucker wants to eat hot dogs and hamburgers when they stop. But so there's more stuff there. But when you're in a lower income neighborhood, you're not going to find those things, and so it's even more difficult for them.
I guess that's one point, right? But I grew up with like food stamps, and I lived in Lakota, right? Like Westchester and everything. And that's a more, that's a less urban area, right? Like a very much a suburb. And I was on food stamps. So how would you recommend a nutritional choice for me if I'm sitting there not able, or if my mom's buying, whatever, and I only have this amount of money to spend? Like a healthy option, like what would it be?
Fruit. It would be. I would always recommend fruit, nuts, something of that nature. There's just something basic that's not processed. They typically, you can typically get an apple or a banana or an orange, something like that, fairly cheap, all things considered. So that's what I always go. Like if I'm on a road trip and I get hungry, I'll buy a bag of almonds, or I'll avoid the almonds in the gas station because they're more expensive there. Obviously, it's a convenience purchase. So you buy like a bag of almonds before I leave, and I'll take those with me along with a couple pieces of fruit, and I'll spend less money. Filling up my reusable can that's made of metal, like rather than, this is a stainless steel can, rather than buying plastic bottles of water to take with me on a road trip.
That's a good.
And, if I have a several hour drive or whatever, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to have a bag of almonds here and a couple pieces of fruit. That's going to be way cheaper than getting my energy drink and my bag of chips and candy bar, in my opinion.
It's the whole notion of the insecurity. We call it, food insecure, housing insecure, financially insecure, socially insecure, internet insecure. I mean, it's really easy to have that conversation, grab a banana, a bag of chips. But when, like you said, Rich, when you're in that environment where, number one, it's not even talked about, and a student or a young person is really in survival mode. I mean, Maslow talked about this, right? His hierarchy of needs in terms of motivation. If you can't get off that ground floor of food, shelter, and water, and this feeling of security, how can we even get to the next stage, of significance and acceptance and these other really important psychological needs that kids have, and that really cause the damage when they just can't get off that ground floor of survival. And when you find a kid that is tinkering on hopelessness, it's generally the fact that, not always, I mean, there's a lot of affluent young people that are pushed into, being self-accelerated and having the pressure, and they have these fixed mindsets from things like youth sports and compulsory grading. And so it's not always just the kid that's, food insecure or financially insecure. it's so, you know, they all have a different relationship with hopelessness. But I think that, as you said, Rich, when you have a kid in an environment where everything is stacked against them, and you're saying, hey man, go find a banana or an apple.
Yeah.
And it's good. I mean, I would not discourage saying that, but like, bro, I'm trying to figure out where I'm sleeping tonight.
Exactly.
My mom's coming.
Well, look, there's so many. You just brought up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I read the book 13 Pillows. And
we did.
Yeah. We don't have time to get into it because we're running long on time here. But I'll say, I just want to say this about the book. There is at the beginning of the book when you talk about the pillow test. Yeah. It was pretty interesting when you said, you know, I'm glad I did instead of I wish I had. You talk about that, like laying your head down on your pillow at night. It's funny because when I listened to an interview from you in 2012 where you made that same exact statement, like it was not just like fluff or something that somebody writes in a book, but yeah. And so you made that statement, and there was just like these little things in that book that that definitely grabbed me. But on the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I had these interesting thoughts about how when we punish children, it's like, you know, like go to your room. And like you're literally stripping a child of connection, which is a necessity. It's you know. So anyway, I like the book. It was kind of a fictional book that tells the story of a group of kids and makes the point of these different pillars that you need in order to create a secure environment in the schools. It's just a good book. Made me think. I liked it. I enjoyed it. Did you actually write that, Tom?
Yeah. Me and another kid. We were, you know, and the funny thing about the book is, man, every page is a true story.
Yeah.
The book was written in honor of a young man named Evan Yarder, and Evan was Alan in the book. And Evan took his own life in the 11th grade. I was in a wrestling room many times with Evan, and I couldn't have picked him out of a lineup. He was just one of these invisible kids, and became less invisible when he did the unthinkable. But every page is just the last 15 years of my life. And I could take you to any page and say, oh, that was this teacher or this kid. The Corella DeVille thing was me. I mean, I was sitting with these young ladies in a lunchroom, and this lunchroom aide, white-haired woman, she's sitting up real straight, and this girl walked by, saw me sitting at the table, started to come in, and she like screamed at her. And I was like, and I lowered my head and I said to those girls that I was sitting with, I'm like, who's old Corella DeVille over there? And they laughed at it. And, you know, and immediately I was like, oh, I screwed up. Like I shouldn't, you know, disparage an educator. And I found out later that her mom was going through cancer, the woman.
Yeah.
And it was a real challenge. So just every page is just my life and what happened. And the piece at the end with the letter is, and the kid's knee, that was a young man that I knew personally, and I know his dad personally. So we just all woven together.
Don't go spoiling the book for people that might want to read it.
Yeah.
For listeners, where can they get the book? Where can they get information on Sweethearts and Heroes? And I didn't get to talk to you about your restaurant, man. I was really interested in your restaurant. We don't have time to go into this, but just a little backstory. During the pandemic, everything was shutting down, and you know, there's this great story about I wish we could talk about the Bull Weevil. It was just an amazing story that you tell, but like Tom's restaurant, they kept it open and they were giving free food to everybody, and just it ended up like flourishing, being one of their best financial years ever. It's truly, you know, an amazing story. So I'm assuming the restaurant's still doing well.
I thought we were going out of business. Just like said, hey, we're going all in. We have 60 employees. You know, they needed us to support and to surround them, and we did. And I thought, you know, it's not my job.
And you didn't lay off one employee, right?
Not one, man, not one.
Yeah.
And we just put our arms around them and the community. And you know, the restaurant, we just had the best 2.5, 3 years in the history of the restaurant. And I don't mean by a little bit. I mean from 2020 to 2021, we had a 47% increase in our gross revenue. And most restaurateurs will be like, what are you talking about? What did you do? Nothing. All we did was make relationship, belonging, connection the most important thing. And the rest is history, man. It's a beautiful story. It's a handful. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, restaurants.
Listen, that's why I said at the top of this discussion, man, that you're a man that lives your passion. Like if I had to sum you up in one sentence, it's that. And the restaurant is a perfect example because, you know, you do like you have sweethearts and heroes, and that's what you do as a job. Many people would see, but it's like, this is the life this guy lives. Like, he has a restaurant and they just decide like, no, we're going to attach ourselves to the community here. We're going to support our staff. We're not cutting back during a time when people were just freaked out. Right. I mean,
Yeah.
the world was uncertain at that time, and you just dug in and was like, nope, this is how I am. And that's why, Tom, like, of all the people that I've crossed over in my life, you're one of the people I respect the most, man.
Well, I wish I felt that way, Rich. I wish I could do more. You know, I try and, you know, I'll kind of end with this, and certainly I'll stay as long as you want, but, you know, I've stood at the base of hundreds of stages. And I remember the first time this happened to me, I was standing at the base of a stage and talking to a young man, and there's tears rolling down his cheek. And I didn't really know what to say, but I said to him, I said, man, you're going to be on the big stage someday. And he looked at the stage and he said, I'm not doing that. I said, no, the big one, you know, in your coffin, hopefully years from now, it's inevitable. You're not getting out of this one alive. And I said, the only people that are showing up, man, because he was struggling with relationships. And I said, the only people that are showing up, man, are the people whose life you've affected in a positive way. Nobody cares about your house or your car or all that other crap. And, you know, from that point forward, you know, 10, 12 years later, I just, you know, said to myself, I don't need anything. I just need to focus on other people and relationships. And there's just nothing else to life than the relationships that we have between you and Cody, you know, between your mom, Rich, and, you know, I know you lost your father at a young age, right? And that's some tough stuff to think about, but it's all about relationships. I mean, there's nothing else to life than relationships. And that's what we need to double down on every day, and understand that these are all human beings, and dignity, the worth, the value that we all have. There's nothing that surmounts it. And it's really easy to be, that person's not part of my intergroup, and not to really step back and think, man, that person has the same feelings and thoughts that I have, and fears and joys, and that's where we need to be focused. I mean, Einstein, and I always end a presentation with this Einstein quote where he said, this world is a dangerous place to live, not because of evil people, but because of those who choose to do nothing about it. And that's the power that we have. And we should be locked into every human we meet every second. And that's a hard thing to do. It's almost biologically impossible to do.
No, but awareness of that will make you lock in more frequently than you otherwise would, you know? So I'm very, very cognizant of how much I'm on my phone when I'm in public spaces. I give you a quick example, and then we'll cut this, but I was at the grocery store shopping the other day, and I had my headphones in, and it was just one of those days where I just didn't want to be bothered. I didn't feel like talking to people. And so I was shopping with my headphones. I got midway through the grocery store. I'm like, what am I doing, man? Like, I actually have the ability to possibly impact somebody today. And I'm shutting myself off from society. You know, I can't even just walk by and be like, hey, how's it going? Or say hello to somebody I'm passing by, or excuse me, or pardon me. So stopped my music, took my headphones out, and was like, no, I'm in a social environment. And if Lord sees it that I need to interact, and by God, I will, I guess. So I cut you off though. Where can people find out more about Sweethearts and Heroes and the book?
I say this to kids all the time. They're like, where did you get that? I'm like, this magic place called the internet. So sweetheartsandheroes.com. Anybody can find it. You got to get yourself like a 15-year-old, Rich. They can find anything for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Just on our website, you know, on social media. You know, I wish we did kind of more stuff like that. But, you know, I told myself years ago that I'm not getting locked into creating the next video or things like that. You know, my job is to keep a low profile and to talk to young people, to help educators and parents. You know, we do a ton of parent work too. And so, you know, if anyone needs anything that's listening to this, you know, don't be afraid to reach out. I try and have 100% response rate. Sometimes it takes me a little bit longer, but I try and get to things myself, and there's just nothing more important.
Well, I have a feeling that as this progresses, you're going to have a more and more difficult time of maintaining a low profile, man, because you're doing awesome stuff.
Well, I appreciate it, man. And
first of all, I appreciate you coming on. But secondly, man, good seeing you, good chatting with you. We don't get to do this often enough. So thanks so much, man.
Keep doing what you're doing, Rich. It's helping a lot of people.
Like you, I feel like I could do more. So thanks, Tom.
Quite Franklin is providing this podcast as a public service, but it is neither a legal interpretation nor legal advice, nor a statement of Quite Franklin policy. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation of that product or entity by Rich Franklin or Quite Franklin. The views expressed by guests on the podcast are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Views and opinions expressed by Quite Franklin employees or representatives are the views and opinions of the persons expressing them, and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of Quite Franklin or any of its officials or principals. Nothing heard on this podcast at any time is medical advice or is intended as medical advice. The listener must always consult his or her personal physician or other qualified medical professional regarding any questions of a medical nature. If you have any questions about this disclaimer, please contact our general counsel.